What's up, everybody? My name is Wayne Felton, and welcome to the Weekly with Wayne once again. This week, we're going to be talking a little bit about COVID and how we went from 2 weeks to 2 years to flatten the curve. I'm actually going to introduce a song to you all that goes 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and that was 2 years later. Wasn't that absurd? We're going to do a little segment I like to call, Do You Remember the Time? Do you remember my bell? All right, that's enough. Woo! Do you remember? All right, that's on the phone, get with me, bro. Till dawn, till 3. What about us, girl? Okay, all right, come on now. Y'all know I love Michael, so I just have. What about? I bet you remember. I bet you remember. And we're gonna do a little segment called Oh Tell Me What?
What would I do?
We're gonna finish off with a segment talking about, now that we're 2 years in, what on earth can we do about this whole COVID thing? So once again, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get right to it. This is either Sister Act 2, excuse me miss, let me kick an introduction type moment, or this is like a Jay-Z, allow me to reintroduce myself type moment. Either way, you could have been anywhere in the world, and you're here with me. Call me Kronos, perfect timing. Go ahead for my daughter's King Trident. Still my voice, Ursula, you tried it. Denzel, you remember this title. Young Sue bring the thunder and the light, and I got new ideas and they so excited. Crypto bro selling NFTs, would like to sell me new thoughts of TV. I provide the lens so you can take a better look. Can't nothing fire, you not burning this book. Keep it 100 and keep it 451. Straight facts are automatics, I don't need a gun. Call me king cause I'm black and I'm wildin'. Call me king cause I stay non-violent. We saw them white tears so we brought the violence. King's new dream crowned up and I'm smiling. Yeah, this is the Week with Wayne. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Wayne Felton, and I'm King's new dream crowned up and I'm smiling. This week marks the 2-year anniversary of the longest 2 weeks in the history of mankind. 2 years ago, some of the initial quarantine started getting rolled out, and the world turned upside down. And we started hearing this phrase over and over again, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, 14 days, flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve. And so we were in our initial quarantines thinking that this was going to be a 2-week quarantine, and we were wrong.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
Now remember, it started out as a China problem, right? And we in America are kind of used to China having these mass outbreaks of things, and we're told to prep for them, but they don't ever really make their way here. It's kind of like mad cow disease, or even with Mexico with the Zika virus. Well, there were some cases that came here, but it wasn't like a pandemic. I mean, we were kind of coached as if it was, but it never became a pandemic here. So we're kind of used to that reality. And it went from being a Chinese problem to a big city problem. And New York and LA were the first ones to kind of start to go haywire on it. But I live in Minnesota, so I was like, that's a them problem. And then it became everybody's problem. And once it became everybody's problem, I think we collectively began to have
emotional damage.
Every governor got on, well, not every, but every governor got on TV talking about some version of a stay-at-home order. Now, depending on what side of Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram you were on, and Instagram kind of was the outlier on this. We're gonna talk about TikTok in a second, but depending on what side of the internet you were on, these were either life-saving tactics or an infringement of freedom. It was either 2 weeks to flatten the curve so that we can keep hospitals from being overwhelmed, or it was 2 weeks of tyranny. I've said this before, but there are some people who are so unoppressed that having rules placed on them feels like oppression. And for those of us who actually experience like real life oppression, it's just another set of rules. But to those for whom the rules have never really mattered, it felt like the ultimate disrespect and violation of their freedoms.
I am a victim of a hate crime. Stanley knows what I'm talking about.
That's not what a hate crime is.
Well, I hated it.
And so there we were, for 2 weeks, everyone at home. 2 weeks, 14 days. That's it. No one's gonna be it. Just talking about it, I feel like Now, the objective here was as the pandemic broke out and we didn't have any way of mitigating how to keep people from getting sick. Because remember at the time, when we went into quarantine, there were no mask mandates. We didn't really know what we should be doing because it was so new. And so as we were going into these quarantines, it was really, this is the only mitigation strategy that we can think of to make sure that we do not overwhelm hospitals with sick people. Because if we overwhelm the healthcare system, then we're all screwed. Now, hindsight would tell us that 2 years later, we didn't overwhelm the healthcare system with a number of people at one time. We've actually overwhelmed it by attrition. We've been at this for so long that people who are in healthcare are struggling to stay in healthcare. Everything changed. Suddenly, we were doing school at home. I was working at a middle school at the time, and we spent those 2 weeks doing trainings on how to deliver instruction online and how do we figure out if kids are actually showing up to school if we're not showing up to school. Some of you suddenly became teachers. For the first time in your life, you had to actually sit down with your children and understand new math. Salons were closed, and so some of us were finding very creative ways to get our hair done, and others of us, it's a dark time, I don't really look back too much. And can we just take a quick second to say the group of people who fumbled the bag on the entire pandemic is Skype. Skype was the one video call group since like 2008. And somehow, from the mid-2000s on, they have been the one provider. And when the time comes for them to step up and shine, they fumbled the bag to the point that we should be talking about, oh, let's meet at Skype. I'll see you on Skype. But we use Zoom. We now use Zoom the way that we use Kleenex. Like Kleenex is an actual name of a product, but we call all tissue paper Kleenex. In the same way, we should be calling all these video conferencing, but what we call them is Zoom. And whether it's Google Meet and whether it's whatever it is, we call them Zooms. Zoom won the pandemic. Here in Minnesota, at least, because I know that there were some states that were just fighting, itching. Florida, Texas, Arkansas, Alabama. It's so fascinating to me that the same states who think that people had the right to own slaves and that was a states' rights issue seem to think that everything is a states' rights issue in the same way. The states that seem to think that they had a states' right to not participate in quarantine, like folks were rallying outside governors' mansions to try to get out of the lockdown. While I was sitting back chilling, I was looking at them like, do you, boo-boo?
Do you, boo-boo? Do you, boo-boo? You know why? Because I'm a do me. Do you, boo-boo? Do you?
But at least here in the great state of Minnesota, 2 weeks turned into 2 months. We were in our stay-at-home order for 2 months. The government just kept extending it because we needed to stay on top of the curve. And we found creative ways to have social interaction in the middle of social distancing. Remember, that was a phrase that we used, and we weren't actually socially distancing, we were physically distancing, but some of us actually had to socially distance because we didn't see anybody. And so we found creative ways to have virtual happy hours. I remember seeing people when it started getting warm outside, because in Minnesota, it's the middle of March, it's like March 14th. It's snowing right now as I'm recording this. I hate it here. But we found ways to connect. We found ways to wade through the depths of the quarantine, the depths of having to stay at home. And I remember, I will never forget, when we finally got to go outside, when we finally got to lift out of the stay-at-home order. It felt like that scene in The Wiz. Once we got over the ding, 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 ding. Now here in Minnesota, that came with a combination of not only being lifted from the lockdown, but summer. And summer in Minnesota is a great thing.
When I finally do what frozen things do in summer. In summer.
And so there we were being able to move around while not having some of the restrictions placed on us. Now, we did see a bump in cases in the South in the summer. And while some people were like, oh, that's because they came out of the mitigation strategies early, some of us understood how the flu works in the state of Minnesota and how it works in the Midwest, and knowing that we were going to hit another bump. And so there we were in October, November, and December hitting another tremendous bump of cases.
Another one.
It's because we still didn't have a mitigation strategy, and there we were going into January, and boom, we finally had the vaccines. But then there was a whole, I won't take the vaccine, and there was that whole conversation, and I'll do an episode about that at another time. But right now, we're recapping. And then we got into the summer 2021, we had the Delta variant come through. And then
Another one.
And then we got into a Marianne, Yo, chick, come close to me. She ain't going home when she supposed to be. I'm getting money like I'm supposed to be. And we just came out of the Omicron. Now, right now, we're not having a lot of conversations about COVID because we're trying to prevent World War III from happening. And for all intents and purposes, we're not. It's going to happen, but that's another episode for another day. But here we are at the 2-year anniversary, and so much about our world has changed. Like the way that we do things, the way that we interact, the fact that my children know when and how to wear a mask, and they've spent the majority of their school years wearing masks. The fact that we know how to socially distance in stores. The way that we can start to look at different people and tell what the political affiliation is based solely on how they respond to a mask mandate. The way that we've learned how to socially interact through apps. The way that some of us are exhausted. The way that some of us have seen family and friendships deteriorate through this distance. We've seen so much. There are countless stories of things that I don't know that I would have ever experienced had it not been for these 2 weeks. COVID also brought some good things, like working from home. And while many of us were like, at the concept of working from home at the beginning of it, now we're starting to see a shift in our culture where people are actually wanting to work from home and actually leaving high-paying jobs in order to take other jobs that may not pay as well. But when you think about the difference for commute and lunch and all those other things, it equals itself out, plus the mental health and the physical health associated with being in your own space. Being able to sit and pet your dog, because I'm not a cat person, but sit and pet your dog while you work. So we shifted from people fighting for the freedom to get out of the house to now people fighting for the freedom to stay at home, especially when the President of the United States says this during the State of the Union address.
It's time for America to get back to work and fill our great downtowns again with people. People working from home can feel safe and begin to return to their offices.
Didn't nobody ask for that, especially now that gas is $732 a gallon and milk costs $813.16. Like, nobody's really asking for, like, can we just go back to the downtowns?
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown.
That's what we call being out of touch. But I think this speaks to a larger shift in our entire conversation since COVID, is there were things that we thought were nuisances at the beginning of this entire thing that we now see as blessings. So as we mark the 2-year anniversary of 2 weeks of Flatten the Curve, I think it's important for all of us to give ourselves grace, recognizing the things that we've had to go through, and to look at the blessings that have come from this, while also recognizing the hundreds of thousands of people who have died at the hands of this virus, the multiple relationships that have fallen apart, people's lives that have shifted drastically, and how some of us who have had COVID deal with some long-haul symptoms because of it. And so we can look at the disrespectful, dirty, ugly, nasty parts of what COVID has presented and also look at the reality that there are blessings that have been associated with it. And so I just want to say congratulations, everyone, because you made it 2 weeks. And after 2 years, we still ain't flattened the curve. We'll be right back. Just 2 weeks, come on, 14 days. After that, all the COVID will go away. It's just 2 weeks, so we can flatten the curve. And I was 2 years later, ain't that absurd? From Kara Baskin to Love is Blind, downloaded TikTok but couldn't tell the time. COVID updates, more like political speech. Did he just say inject your body with bleach? It's just 2 weeks, come on, 14 days. After that, all the COVID will go away. Okay, the governor said we'll extend a bit. CO2 in the mask is making us sick. We're trying to fill the void in Trump's leadership. For folks stuck off the coast on a Disney ship. For talking pandemic and talking 5G. You're blocking family on the research is conspiracy. Quarantine cuts, quarantine meals, quarantine ISO, that's how we feel. Essential workers pay the heavy toll, from nurses to those who work in the grocery store. Download this app for the virtual happy hour. You see my invite, we're streaming the baby shower. So whether through Zoom or Google Meet, the only way to show love came through a screen. It's just 2 weeks, come on, 14 days. After that, all the COVID will go away. It's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Bruh, it's 2 years later, ain't that absurd? Just 2 weeks, come on, 14 days. After that, all the COVID will go away. Just 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and that was 2 years later. Wasn't that absurd? And we're back with a little segment I like to call...
Remember the time. Remember my baby.
the time? Do you remember my pain? I just want to take you back 2 years really quickly to remind you of one thing. The most valuable piece of paper on earth at the beginning of this pandemic was toilet paper. I don't know if y'all remember this, but do you remember going to the grocery store? And I can't even go to the grocery store without some ones that's clean with a shirt, with a team. Going to the grocery store and all of the aisles were empty. During the middle of the Omicron variant most recently, I remember trying to get a COVID test. Ordered big face rollies, I got 2 of those. Trying to get your hands on those doggone tests was next to impossible. That's what it was like to get toilet paper, like the thing that you use to wipe your behind. And so as we start talking about first world problems, I just want to remind everybody that just 2 years ago, folks was finding some nasty creative ways to do this. I also realized that there are some folks who just don't. They just hop in the shower afterwards. And first of all, I think that's nasty. Second of all, I guess I should be okay with the fact that you wash your behind. But third of all, that's nasty. Sparked a debate about whether or not we should be using wipes or tissue paper. Wipes is the correct answer. I don't care about the environment like that. So the next time that you're at Target and you're walking around and you see plenty of toilet paper and you see plenty of hand sanitizer and you see plenty of paper towels, I want you to just take a second and ask yourself, do you remember the time? Do you remember? And that's been, do you remember the time? Thank you so much for watching this week. We're going to wrap this entire show up with a new segment we're going to call
Tell me what would I do?
So Wayne, we just listened to you talk about 2 years of Flatten the Curve and how we're now here. What on earth do we do with this information? First of all, thank you for making it this far. I'm honored. But second of all, I hope as we collectively get an understanding of the fact that it's been 2 years to do a 2-week thing, that people have actually died, that over the Omicron, I know it's Omicron, I understand, variant, I knew more people who got sick than ever before. It's important for us to acknowledge that all of us have been experiencing a global health pandemic for the last 2 years, and we've had the expectation of normalcy. We've had the expectation of returning to normal. We've had the expectation of productivity in the middle of watching people die and get sick. Not to mention being in the middle of a housing crisis, in the middle of an economic crisis, in the middle of a geopolitical crisis. So this expectation that we place on ourselves in part because of social media and how we have to present ourselves, of normalcy, of acting like we're okay, I want you to give yourself and others grace. Because it's been 2 years, and let's keep it real. We're not done. It ain't even over yet. I hope at the end of this episode, you remember all the things that you've been through in the last 2 years. I mean, like enough things to not have a mental breakdown, and remind yourself of the grace that you deserve, and remind yourself of the grace that others deserve. This has been
Tell me what would I do?
And that's also our show. Thank you so much for making it this far. I'm so grateful that you take the time to watch me, and we will see you next week. Peace.
This is the week with Wayne. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Wayne Felton, and I'm King's new dream crowned up, and I'm smiling. Huh?